Thank you all for coming. And it's my pleasure to introduce our guests for today. So let me begin with Rana Dasgupta, who's over there. He's the author of Tokyo Cancelled, a collection of contemporary folk tales, and a novel called Solo, which went on to win the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. I particularly admire his first nonfiction work, Capital, The Eruption of Delhi, which blends skillful interviews with close observation of the rapidly changing city in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. This book went on to win the Ryszard Kapuscinski Award and the Prix Émile Guimet. As someone who has lived in Delhi off and on for a total of about 17 years since the 1960s, which is roughly the amount of years that Rana has lived there continuously since 2000, I was drawn to the blend of deep historical sensibility and acute awareness of contemporary turbulence that Rana Dasgupta brought to the writing of this book. He takes us, the readers, with artful effortlessness into the varied lives through which he narrates the violent effervescence of Delhi in its embrace of capitalism. His second work of nonfiction is After Nations, which is to be published next year by Penguin Random House. In fact, some of you might have heard him talk about it earlier this week. In that book, he returns to questions of what happens as the nation-state loses coherence and legitimacy, a question that has been of great interest to sociologists and anthropologists since the 1980s. If nationalism enabled the nation-state, as Ernest Gellner and Benedict Anderson, among others, famously argued, Rana Dasgupta offers an examination how nation-states may now be coming apart under the twin pressures of nationalisms multiplied even as they are fractured, and globalization creating an intricate web of connections across territories, regions, and continents. Rana Dasgupta is also an essayist who has written for Harper's, for Granta, The New Statesman, and for several years he taught a course on 21st century culture and ideas at Brown University. So I'm glad to have you here, Rana. I should now introduce Dr. Mariam Aslani, who's sitting here to my immediate left. She is currently a visiting fellow in the program in Agrarian Studies at Yale, which I have the privilege of co-directing with Professor Elizabeth Wood, who happens to be sitting in the audience. Mariam was able to join us with the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Global Fellowship and came to us from the Università Ca' Foscari, Venezia. Before that, she has been at Wolfson College, Oxford, and the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. As a sociologist, Mariam Aslani has spent a lot of time doing research in Western India, where she has also lived earlier as a student. Some of this research resulted in her first book, Contested Capital, Rural Middle Classes in India. More recent research has taken her back to Western India to study how villagers are dealing with climate change and to study how climate change affects social stratification that is already part of rural society in the form of religion, caste, gender, ethnicity, and other factors. She has also spent time in Colombia, most recently doing research on peasant societies on a comparative project on commodity agriculture and its effects on peasant communities. During the course of doing this research, she has spent time in Fiji, Cambodia, Ghana, Cape Verde, and the Gambia. This multi-country research is now part of the book she is working on called Peasants, Their 21st Century Crisis, and Why the Globe Depends on Them. She's also working simultaneously on another book, Goddess, Why Divinity is Capitalism's Most Valuable Product. And both these books are to be published by Knopf. So today we have them both with us, and they have been working together and have designed a podcast for Audible about cotton farmers in Maharashtra. In fact, this was launched yesterday, right?
Yes.
So the podcast is now available as of yesterday. Along with the comparative research that Mariam has been doing in other countries, this podcast examines the role of small farmers or peasants continue to play in world agriculture and the challenges they face from the onslaught of contemporary versions of capitalism, but also environmental distress and their own desires to find more fulfilling lives as new relations emerge between the country and the city in a world where farmers are ever more deeply enmeshed in world affairs. And that perhaps inspires the topic they have chosen, the global countryside. So what we'll do, we'll begin with a brief discussion of the very term global countryside and how they chose that to describe this work and what we'll talk of in this session. And maybe understand how that term comes to be chosen for this. And then we can jump into more details about the podcast itself. That was, as I said, just released. And as was announced, towards the end, we'll save about 10-15 minutes to field questions from any and all of you that might be addressed to both of them. So with that, let me turn this over to Mariam and Rana. I think Mariam's going to get us started off, right?
Okay. Can I just jump in and just say something about the photographs? So
sure.
These are photographs that will be playing throughout our conversation, and they're from many different places. I think, Mariam, you've shot all of these photos, and they're in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And we tried to give you a sense, we've spent a lot of time together in some of these places, we're trying to give you a sense of some of the landscapes that we're going to be talking about and some of the personalities too. But then in no particular order, but we'll try and fill in some of the narratives. Okay, Mariam, global countryside.
Yes. Well, it's an enormous pleasure to be here, and Shivi, thank you for that introduction. I'm going to get that note from you to write it in my bio in the future. It was very good, thank you. Let me start, I think it's a good start by saying a few words about the global countryside before I get into the crisis and tell you why I decided to work in this subject. Just to be clear, today I'm mainly talking about the countryside today. I mean the agrarian population in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And just to say a few words, during the course of my research, I've been doing research on the countryside for the last 15 years, and the reason I chose this subject is because the countryside is absent from the global conversations. Scholars, policymakers, journalists are increasingly ignoring the countryside, and as a result, ignoring or dismissing a large part of the human population. And as a consequence, they may perhaps unknowingly kind of contribute to the political elimination of the countryside. And why is that? I think that's perhaps because peasants or small farmers they seem to be an outdated category, the very opposite of progress. And the reason for this is that in the both end of the political spectrum, right and left, there has been this assumption that in order to become modern, we have to get rid of the peasantry. Just to give an example, Adam Smith assumed or imagined that smallholders are going to give away to big landowners who are going to improve the land better, Karl Marx foresaw the elimination and overtake by socialist management. And they both share the same belief that sooner or later, the small agriculture is going to be taken over by capital and machinery, and that cities are eventually going to absorb most of humanity. But that hasn't happened. And we haven't ceased to be an agrarian population. In fact, today, 250 years after the Industrial Revolution, 43% of humanity lives in the countryside. In fact, as recent as 2008, that was half the humanity that live in the countryside, half of which belong to the peasant or small farmer category. So in a way, today, quarter of human species belong to the peasant category. And just to give you a bit of boring statistic, around 70% of the world population somewhat depends on them for their food. And, but also small farmers or peasants play a significant role that big agriculture cannot, because they are better managers of land, soil, biodiversity, water, and also in a way they mediate our relationship with nature. And so just, I'm saying all of that just to say that the peasant communities are not a historical throwback, even in the 21st century global system. Around quarter of humanity belongs to this category. I can go on and on, but maybe I just stop here. And yeah, I'm going to kind of get into the crisis, but I think it's a good place to stop.
But so say a little bit about the changing character of this peasantry as they enter the 21st century. Clearly, the kind of peasants who were seen as perhaps an obstacle to the modernization of society by some of these philosophers, writers, social theorists you mentioned, were transformed already by the forces of modernization of agriculture. And what we are witnessing today is not just the endurance of a class of small farmers in places where this has not been abolished, but also the return to, as you were just pointing out, the rediscovery of the value of small farmers, including in places where smallholder farming has emerged as an unlikely alternative, perhaps, to crops that were previously seen as most efficiently cultivated in large farms or even in plantations. So maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the key crops, because commodity agriculture being so dominant, some of the key crops through which you carried out this inquiry.
Okay, I start by saying that first, let's elaborate on why the peasant category of small farmers still exists, because this question actually comes to me often from people, that why they still exist. And I think in the absence of exceptional level of industrialization, the large population, what can sustain large population is really land. And I think even Asia's industrialization, which has been vast enough to absorb millions of peasants, it cannot be necessarily repeated elsewhere. And many people who could have joined factories have done so. But there are also people, I mean, I've seen in my fieldwork over and over that the people who prefer the security of village life, they have attachment to land, and they don't want to necessarily expose themselves to uncertainty of the cities, or the hyper competition, or isolation, or the urban slums, and so they persist. But of course, the peasant is an ever-changing category. The reason is that in order to survive, they have to reinvent themselves, and this is what they've been doing throughout history, using various sort of innovation to go through cycles of crisis and renewal. And one of the most fascinating things that I find, I'm engaged in my fieldwork, is that how this reinvention happening. And I think the countryside is a site of a remarkable innovation. And I see increasingly farmers, especially small farmers, are seeking opportunities to create for themselves an alternative economies through which they can sustain their livelihood in the villages, but also sustain their farms. So they are engaged in, and this opportunity seeking happens in the context of rural industrialization, and they created this hyper they've created this world which kind of oscillates between industry and agriculture, between town and cities. And I mean, you know Shivi this very well, that the diversification is now a central feature of agrarian communities. I see, like in households across the world, I mean, especially in rural India, in a family of 5, there are actually 5 occupations. And somebody works in a factory, somebody is a teacher, but they're also kind of engaged and in the family life. So there is a lot of kind of, innovation, kind of small businesses and transport or anything like that to kind of like keeps them going.
So you've spoken a little bit about the ingenuity and innovation, which let's talk a little bit about the other side, the conditions in which this happens.
Yeah.
So we know that in the past, they have also weathered, especially if you look at small farmers, peasantries in the regions you've focused on, so large parts of Asia, sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of South America. They have weathered, in a sense, one set of crises which came alongside with the intense commercialization of agriculture in broadly the 20th century, as more and more of farms and farmers got incorporated into these vast global networks of producing crops and commodities for world markets. And more recently, in a sense, they have had to encounter a new kind of more environmental crisis, which is the crisis of climate change. So they've, in a sense, weathered one, and now they're well in the midst of another one. So talk a little bit about these crises and how they have affected farm families.
Okay. I would describe the crisis like a class war between the humanities, urban, and the rural halves, where cities control money, politics, media, military, market, finances, and everything. And of course, climate change is the other crisis, but let's take them, and there are many other crises, but let's take them one by one. In terms of urban takeover of the rural landscape, we saw an increasing takeover by corporation banks and agribusiness in rural spaces where farmers are forced to depend on purchasing seeds, expensive chemicals like fertilizers, pesticides, and go into this cycle of credit and loans, which really undermines the very foundation of the rural economy. And of course, climate crisis is intensifying this other crisis. And then these crises have consequences. So one consequence, and the consequences are all around us. So for example, I'm just going to give some examples. In Africa, in parts of Africa, many farmers who are no longer able to sustain their livelihood through agriculture have no choice but to join militant group. And then the other symptom of this crisis is migration. So we have more and more number of land refugees or climate refugees who are, because of climate change, can really no longer sustain their living through agriculture, and they have to leave the villages for metropolis, or if they're lucky enough, just cross the border and go to other countries. But perhaps one of the most tragic crises is farmer suicide. In India, this is relatively well documented. And in this century alone, 500,000 Indian farmers have taken their own life. And majority of this is actually happening in the cotton belt of Maharashtra, where I do my field work. And there the reason for this is that basically because of the law and the market and the penetration of the corporation, and some of the unfavorable laws that are imposed on farmers by the government, farmers find themselves in a situation that they actually get less than what they spent or basically invested in their production after kind of selling these crops. So these are the kind of the negative, basically dark parts of rural India or the changing landscape, of the countryside.
So from what you're describing, the deeper becoming more deeply enmeshed in market relationships, and particularly in debt and credit relationships,
yes, exactly.
Has made it extremely difficult on the one hand for them to remain viable. But if you take again, since you concluded this particular set of comments with the example of farmers in Western India and the cotton areas, now there's two things about that, right? So one is that these are areas particularly vulnerable to climate variability. And the other thing is cotton is one of the first crops in which genetically modified varieties have also been used of late. And these have also meant that even greater dependence on suppliers of such varieties. So I wonder if you want to say something about how, on the one hand, the diversification of the family. So, as you were saying a little while ago, some members of the family might be farming, but others are in small trades, yet others have found urban vocations. And that is clearly one strategy being adopted to maintain the viability of the farming household. In a sense, one of the biggest challenges that most farming societies are facing, and this is not peculiar to India, you see this reported from Southeast Asia, from Africa as well, is what you might call the inability of farming societies to reproduce themselves,
yes,
which is young people increasingly unwilling to remain in farming. And when farming families move out of farming and other people move into farming, which might be recent migrants, other poor landless people who now get some access to land, their financial situation may be even more precarious when it comes to responding to these kinds of pressures. So if you can just say a little bit more about some of these changes, then we should turn to how these are then, shall we say, aggravated by things like climate change and drought and so on. Yeah.
So I just want to, because we are also kind of talking about the podcast, I just want to give some examples from some of my characters in the podcast. So because you talked about social reproduction, I want to give an example of two young farmers who I was working with when I was recording for the podcast. And so these young farmers, I mean, their families have been in cotton farming for generations. They went to cities, they got educated, and they had a job. But at some point, they had to come back. Why? Because being from a rural background, they were not competitive enough for the urban market. And secondly, they had to come back and look after the family life. It's not very easy for farmers, or at least I find in my research, to kind of pick up and go, because where do they go? And
I think it's worth adding that, I mean, in the case of one of those farmers, he had he felt a moral obligation.
Exactly.
He said, I have to be part of my community. And so I think what you're describing is definitely the case. There are obviously many, many people who are leaving farming, who want to leave farming or who have to leave farming. But there are many people who want to stay in farming, and many people who actually have the opportunity to leave who don't, because farming is where they belong, farming is what they believe in. And there is a feeling that the land that has come through the ancestors is sacred, and that we are supposed to be doing this activity. So I think it's a very complex story, and it comes down at the end to individual personalities and decisions as well.
Yes.
Sorry.
And also land is security. And also it's not very easy. There are such of laws, I'm not going to get into it, it's quite boring. It's not very easy to sell agricultural land in India. So it's not easy for them to sell and go, but also it's security, and as Rana said, it's considered as sacred. So these two young farmers got back to the village, and they just try various things to get the farm going. But one of the very interesting challenges they had, I mean, one was 29 and the other one was 30. They could not get married because nobody wanted to marry their daughters to farmers. And I mean, I saw in the villages in this region where I was in my fieldwork, there were so many young farmers, men, who were single, and they were terrified that they could not just form a family. So these are the kind of social aspects you were talking about. And do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the reasons we wanted to put photographs up is because all of this conversation can sound extremely abstract when we're sitting in New Haven, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of people who we've never seen. And one of the things that we tried to do in this podcast is to personalize a lot of these stories and to turn it into the kind of stories that you might hear in much more proximate context. Stories about ordinary things that people want to do. They want to get married, they want to build a family, they want to build a house, they want to save money. And just how excruciatingly difficult those things are in this context where essentially the dynamics of markets and law are set up to extract from these farmers more than they invest. So they're constantly actually in a greater negative financial situation every year, and therefore this feeling of just constant extraction. And this is about cotton. You're all, I imagine, in this audience wearing cotton. So these people are not, divorced from your lives. And the reason the cotton you're wearing, the cotton that is furnishing your house, is as cheap as it is because, and this is the sort of big story of the podcast, is that the farmers that are growing it, at least in India, have been put in a situation where they will continue farming it even at a loss, and the corporations that process it and distribute it and commercialize it are find that they're actually able to pay less and less for it, and it will still keep coming. And this is, I think, what you're talking about, the sort of political elimination. It seems completely counterintuitive that anybody would continue doing something that they have to pay to do. And the farmers that we met used the phrase negative subsidy. So it's not that we farmers get a subsidy, we are subsidizing you. We're paying you to buy our cotton. But a very complex mesh of things keeps farmers in this situation because the exits are blocked, or because they have an attachment to this activity, and because they think about their activity not in the purely economic terms that the rest of us assess our kind of career decisions and things like this. So when you see the impact this has on kind of individual lives, it's extremely moving and indeed terrifying. So Mariam talks about these two farmers who have come back to farm, and we hope that they will make a success of their farms. But we also interviewed two widows of farmers who had committed suicide, two women who, at a very early stage in their lives, found themselves saddled with children, debts, and the social stigma of having a farmer, their husbands kill themselves, and in-laws who tried to use that opportunity to take back the land that had belonged to their husbands. We also interviewed a moneylender, because the moneylender plays a crucial role in sort of keeping the liquidity flowing in these communities. And those moneylenders charge between, 5 and 15% a month interest, so that many of these people find their debts doubling very quickly. And so I think it's important, I think especially for us as people writing about this, not to reduce it simply to a set of statistics or global trends or whatever it is, but to say this is hundreds of millions of individual stories of people who are personally embattled with the global system in a way that even people who are having a very difficult time, let's say in the United States, can have very little conception of.
Yeah, so I just wanted to draw attention also to this, this question that Rana brings up of the negative subsidy that farmers are now providing to industry and urban life. It's, in a sense, a problem that's been aggravated in the last few decades because India and some other countries in the world, in a sense, experimented. It is a modern experiment in investing in small-scale agriculture. And one of the examples, we were talking about the moneylender and the extortionate interest they charge. So one of the aspects of the experiment was setting up government and cooperative credit banks and so on to lend people money at low rates of interest in the farm sector. Now, since the 1990s, with the collapse of that sort of experiment of 30-some years, the farmers are more at the mercy of this kind of private money lending than they were previously. In fact, it's ironic because it was an attempt to get them out of the clutches of such money lending, which had been so prevalent in the colonial period, that this whole program had been started, and now with the program being dismantled, they are back in the clutches of such money lenders. And so some of the inability and what Rana called the blocked exit, some of the inability to escape this situation has to do with these cycles of debt. But I also want to invite a discussion on the other side of this picture, which is farmers who are discovering alternate ways to remain in agriculture, especially those who are questioning the rather adverse outcomes of industrial and chemical agriculture and trying to return to a kind of a small farming, which is more sustainable, which perhaps is more organic, and so forth. And some of it is happening in the very heartland of the places where industrial agriculture had been most deeply embedded, like the Punjab, for instance, or Western India, where Mariam has been doing a field work, where a new generation of people who, through the very attachments to their land and villages, and through discovering the problems that participating in industrial agriculture has created for them, are trying to rediscover small farm agriculture, which is more sustainable and more viable by moving in alternate directions. And so that's also part of the story. So there is the story of a certain abject, almost political destruction of farming.
Yeah,
There's also,
exactly. I think we both feel very strongly about this because these people are not the eternal victims.
Yeah.
These are brilliant, imaginative, incredibly positive people. These are places of laughter and beauty, and they are brilliant farmers. Mm-hmm. They are extremely good at what they do. As Mariam said, they have an ecological consciousness which is extraordinary. They know how the kind of interrelations of different crops and botanical varieties work. They understand air and water and soil in very, very intricate and local ways. They know that this soil is different from 200 meters down the road. And so when you're with these people, they're not really talking all the time about their problems. They're talking about possibilities and opportunities. And the farmers who are in their 20s and 30s are fully sort of networked. They are on the internet. They're watching your Instagram accounts and seeing, you know, how life can be in all over the world. And one of the things that they are plugging into is farming information from all over. So one of the farmers that we were interviewing for this podcast, he was experimenting with some crops that he'd got seeds from Latin America, the dragon fruit, which is a fruit that sells for quite a lot of money in Indian cities. And it works very well in the kind of hotter, wetter climate that he was dealing with. And so he was trying to hedge against cotton by expanding into dragon fruit. But again, the problem of innovation is always money. Every experiment costs money. Every experiment produces failure and risk. And so farmers are scared to possibly give up a year's income because they've done an agricultural experiment which they don't know what the outcome will be. And it's absurd because these farmers, some of them are organizing, they are very political. I mean, they know that if they are not political, they cannot change their condition. The farmer is always in direct contact with politics and the law, and therefore they are always organized, they're always talking about politics. And Mariam sat in on an amazing conversation between a farmer representative and a sort of manager of the local marketplace. And the farmer was presenting demands, and one of the demands he was presenting was a series of, he wanted them to give 10 grants to help farmers do some of these experiments. Now, the value of the grants that he wanted was, I think...
$300.
$300. So the kind of amounts that we're talking about, when they're translated, sound absurd. You know, you have people who kill themselves for debts of $1,000, people whose annual income might be $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, and who cannot lay their hands on $200, $300 simply to do these kinds of things. So it is it's when you go in, you realize that you feel yourself incredibly trapped because the sort of financial universe is so limited that it's very difficult to sort of go and hang out for 6 weeks in a city and look for a job. There's just not the liquidity in this system for that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So let me turn to the discussion that we have been postponing so far, which is on the environment side.
Okay.
So tell us something about your more recent work on the effects of climate change and rural certification and things like that.
Well, I'm still in the midst of that research,
Yeah.
so I'm still working through it. But just to build on what you said, there are already existing a structure of inequalities in these places. Gender, religion, caste, ethnicity, even age. Basically, what I'm doing for my academic work at Yale is to look at how climate change actually increases or intensifies this form of inequality, and also how basically farmers come to adapt to climate change. I mean, just to say one quick thing, farmers being at the forefront of climate change, they're also extremely innovative, dealing with climate mitigation, adaptation. And I study adaptation in particular, and I see that it's so kind of hierarchical, you know, and it really matters who owns the biggest piece of land in the village, who have access to water, and the basic things that basically farmers need. And there are often like discussions in the village about some shared problem, for example, water. And the small farmers are left out, women are left out. I mean, and you see that the inequality is increasing because of the climate change. But I also should just say something about one of the most devastating impact of climate change, which really kind of leads into the economic situation of the farmers, is that the disruption of the agricultural calendar that farmers are used to for generations. And now that agricultural calendar is completely out of the window, because they knew when it's going to rain, when the rain is going to stop, so they could adjust their planting, their sowing, their harvest accordingly. Just to give an example of cotton farmers, around 1st of June, there is a festival, a religious festival in India, and that's when cotton farmers start sowing. And because
that's linked to the monsoon's arrival.
Yes, because they expect the monsoon to arrive in a few weeks. But now farmers are completely confused. Do I sow? Do I not? Because is it going to rain? Is it not going to rain? Some farmers just go ahead because that's what they've always done. They sowed on 1st of June. They go ahead. It doesn't rain. And they have to re-sow. And I think on average, cotton farmers have to re-sow 3 times. And every time they have to buy seeds because they no longer use the traditional seeds.
Right.
The agribusiness is there. They have to buy. And that seeds requires a specific sort of fertilizer and pesticides. And also the labor. It's mostly unpaid family labor, but again, it's kind of devastating. And they have to keep doing it. And then it suddenly rains, and there is what farmers call freak rains. It just comes and washes away everything. So it's quite, and of course, I mean, it's no brainer. The poorer farmers are mostly at the receiving end of this.
I think it's worth pointing out when you talk, there's a lot of subjects here. When we talk about seeds, the United States, China, and Germany, between them, the large corporations in these 3 countries control nearly all of the seed markets, the pesticide markets, and the fertilizer markets. So we're talking about poor people, but we shouldn't imagine there's no money in this system. For global corporations, a couple of billion people is a big market. And so there is an extremely well-organized corporate system to market to these people, to sell to these people. And because the cycle of income of the farmer is once a year, but their costs are all up front, they have to buy seeds and all these chemicals, those corporations, of course, they don't have to concern themselves with how these farmers will fund those purchases, but money lenders are very much in the background. So between sort of money lenders and corporations, these farmers are really in a very dangerous situation. The other thing I wanted to say is that...
Just can I say something on the money lenders? Because I've seen around the sowing season, when farmers need money to buy seeds, I call money lenders as predatory figures. They really hang around in the village, and because the farmer needs money for seed, and of course, I mean, you said interest is between 5 to 15. Actually, in villages where I was doing field work, it's 20% per month. And it's really insane. And they just basically go around, give cash, and of course, get a land collateral, which as one money lender described to me is that we would eat up their land.
Yeah.
And
but this money lending is no longer, in the past, there was often a separate group of people, a separate caste who were professionally moneylenders and merchants and so on. But now it is sort of woven into rural life because it's maybe sometimes members of the same family who own the little store from which the fertilizers and pesticides of these corporations control are being sold. And often the small retailer is also doubling up as the moneylender in many instances.
Yes.
In our podcast, I mean, the moneylender is the most extraordinary and demonic character I have ever met. And he literally says, he says, you cannot, because of course Mariam's asking him whether he feels responsible in any way. He says, in order to do this business, you cannot engage with the feelings of other people. That's as soon as you do that, you start being kind, and then you lose all your money. So he says at a certain point in this totally unbelievable interview, he says, as soon as the farmer crosses my threshold, he is dead. He may continue to live and walk around for another year, but he's already dead. So there's a full consciousness of exactly how these social relations are working. The other thing I wanted to add, I don't know how we are in time.
We probably have another couple of minutes,
right?
Because then we must save time for some questions.
The other thing I wanted to say about what Mariam was saying about inequalities between, let's say, gender and caste, we're talking specifically about India here, is to give an example, that a lot of power relations in these villages are exerted through things like water and land. So we spent a lot of time with a widow. Her husband had killed himself 12 years before, and she had 3 young children, all daughters. And Indian farming families have to pay to marry their daughters. So she had that financial burden, she had the trauma of losing her husband, and she had to sort of turn around a farm that he had failed to manage. And one of the really crazy aspects of all this, and there are sort of organizations and communities of widows of farmers, because these people find themselves subject to very specific kinds of traumas and sort of attacks by the communities.
And violence.
And at time, and great violence. So first of all, their in-laws usually blame them for the suicide of their husbands, saying that you obviously worried him, gave him anxieties, traumatized him, and he was unhappy. But because everybody is desperate for land, everybody is on the edge, a vulnerable widow who did not inherit this land herself, but got it through her husband, finds herself attacked from every side by people who are just trying to either terrify her into leaving or actively kill her. And so one of the forms of terror that is applied is to cut off water. So that you can, the trauma of sowing seeds that then die in the ground because they cannot be watered is something that just peasants, it's one of the nightmares of their lives. So you deny people water, or you block the road to their farms so they cannot get any supplies in, or they cannot borrow a tractor when the community has hired a tractor. So gender is key and caste is key. In Indian villages, these are the two kind of vulnerabilities that are exploited by desperate communities who all are suffering the same kind of problems.
Okay. So, with an eye to the time, this is when we'll stop speaking for a bit, and we'll see if any of you have any comments or questions that we can address as a panel, especially our visitors. Yeah. Yes, please.
Yeah. If you could say something about the impact of microcredit, the Green Bank.
Can you use the microphone so others can hear you too?
I wonder if you could say something about the impact, the efficacy of microloans in the sectors of the economy you've been observing?
Well, there are quite a lot of that. I mean, there are these small microfinance groups. Quite a lot of it is actually organized by women. They're helpful, but they're not very effective because the amount is often very little, and most farming families already have various loans to the bank, to the cooperative bank, to family members, to money lenders. So that's, although helpful, but it's not a massive help.
Gentleman there.
You mentioned the elimination of USAID. Did that make a role in the role with these farmers, or are there different people?
So USAID is, we've actually recently taken a trip to Peru to So I should say that we're related by passion and not only by the global countryside. And so I travel on some of Mariam's research trips, and we just took a trip to Peru for the cocaine chapter of her book.
Where Rana came as my bodyguard.
Yeah, that's right. So USAID had a huge presence in Peru, and has tried to help the country essentially get rid of the Colombian cartels, crack down on coca cultivation, and gradually convert farmers to other crops like cocoa, pineapples, a lot of other things. Farmers, this was going on at the time that Trump was sort of shutting down USAID, and I think that this is a very specific context. I can't speak for other places in the world, but I think the consensus was that it would not have a particularly significant effect because the projects that USAID was doing in the first place were not very effective. And the reason for that is that, and again, this is a problem very specific to cocaine, but these are people in very, very remote parts of the Andes who could not easily, to transport their crops to the coastal metropolises where they might get higher prices was very, very costly because those were 30-hour drives over the Andes. And therefore, transporting cocaine or coca paste in the opposite direction into Bolivia or to Brazil, cocaine is not perishable, unlike a pineapple. So it's a very good crop to transport. And of course, the returns are much higher. So USAID and the Peruvian government have really not been successful in persuading these farmers. Farmers were constantly saying, if you want us to do these other crops, you have to build highways, you have to create markets, and allow us to have the systems to do these crops. And in the absence of those things, this is the best thing to do. And even the people we met from the Peruvian government who were working with USAID on these things said that maybe we've had success with maybe 10% of farmers. Yeah. But the quantity of cocaine and the value of the trade was growing all the time. So,
and even this organization, I interviewed Davida that works with USAID, and even in terms of because in Peru, actually cultivating coca is legal, and they couldn't even persuade farmers to move to legal cultivation of coca. And I mean, from the farmer's perspective, it was that, well, A, I get more money for illegal, and B, they tell us that they come in so and so a day to pick up my produce. They never show up, and the money is much less, and they put the crop under so much scrutiny that we often fail to meet the standard, and even if we pass, the money is not going to come in anytime soon. So there is really not much appetite for it, I would say, from my research. I only know about Peru. I don't know about other parts of the world.
Yeah, that's a very local answer to that question. I don't know how effective a USAID has been elsewhere, and I'm sure there's very different stories.
We can probably take another question. Yes, please. In the back, I'll come to you next. Yeah.
So obviously a lot of this talk was focusing on specifically cotton farming in Maharashtra, but I saw some pictures of what I think was sugarcane farming, I assume also around the region.
Yeah.
And from what I have heard of that sort of story, it's a bit different in that, from what I understand, most of the farming of sugarcane is industrial and is owned by large corporations involved in the state government. But I was just kind of curious what commonalities there might be across the region, I guess, in how those different rural communities navigate, because I also know that debt bondage is big there as well. But I guess I was just kind of curious about the commonalities between what common threads exist across different crop communities. I guess.
Cotton, sugarcane, etc.
Well, sugarcane in India is not industrialized. It's actually operated by small family farms. when it leaves the land, of course, it's taken by cooperative, and after that, it's kind of is in the hand of big cooperatives. But the cultivation of it is mainly by small farmers, although it's not the case in other countries. For example, in Brazil, I understand it's operated on big pieces of land. The commonality, I think, beside the things I said, I mean, climate change is a common thread everywhere. The problem of moneylender, I think, is very common in places, at least I've done work. The market, and basically, so the crops I actually study, just to be very specific, mainly rice, sugarcane, cocoa, cotton, and cocoa. These are mainly cultivated by small farmers. And the struggle are pretty much the same. I mean, in fact, one of the reasons I wanted to study cocoa is because it's basically an illegal or illegitimate crop, is to show that actually the very same problem is apparent, or it exists among the cocoa farmers. So yes, climate change, social reproduction, access to market, transport, availability of capital for kind of diversification. I think these are some of the and increasingly crime and insecurity over land, issue of land, and increasingly crime, because I mean, in the case of our podcast, actually the first episode, if you ever get to listen to it starts with the murder of a young farmer. Two cousins basically fight over a piece of land, which they inherited from their grandfather, and it actually over a small patch where the boundary should be drawn. They get into a fight, and it gets nasty, and one of them gets killed. And yes, so this is also like you see, and it doesn't come from I mean these are not like violent people, but the pressure is so extreme that sometimes it just leads to dark places. And of course, farmer suicide. That's not specific to India. You see it basically, I mean, even in France.
I think it's what's really interesting about all this is that what you're describing coexists with peasant farming, and they all have their place in the global economy. In some places, like sort of Indonesian palm oil or whatever, there's sort of these huge plantations with very low-paid agricultural laborers, and that's the way that the system at large likes to extract palm oil. But in other places, peasants are very, very good partners for corporations because they don't have much bargaining power.
Right.
They are very good at what they do. They have a family organization, family unit that's set up to do this thing, own only this thing. But they own, 3 acres, 4 acres, whatever it might be, and there are thousands and thousands of houses, and they're not politically unified. So corporations are in a very strong position when they're dealing with those kind of people. And so whilst you do see certain crops, it's better for them to be organized on a vast scale and all that sort of thing. In a lot of other crops or in a lot of other places, there's been no penetration of that kind of system because corporations are extremely happy with the way things are. And if you look specifically at cotton, and rice, often the best quality crops are produced by peasants, and it's much lower grade crops that are produced by large industrial installations.
Okay, so we are at our time, but we can take one brief question. That will probably be the last one. Yeah. Over there, right at the back.
Does the government have any sensitivity to the plight of these farmers and make any attempt to improve the situation for them?
Yes, I mean, just briefly, I give an example of India, which is a country I know best. Yes, there are many schemes. For example, widows of farmers who committed suicides are compensated, although with a small amount. And there are now licensed money lender, for example, where, I mean, basically they've been introduced to limit the reach of the illegal moneylenders. It's not very kind of widespread because, of course, you need quite a lot of paperwork. And also to get that license for moneylenders is very difficult. And yes, of course, there are quite a lot of schemes here and there. I mean, we have Money Lending Act now in India where farmers can actually register a police complaint against moneylenders. But the problem is, as one of the farmers I work with who actually also happened to study law in a university in city, he says, but most farmers, especially the older generation, suffer from is illegal illiteracy. So they don't really know where their rights are. And I mean, there are other schemes that the government is trying to do. They're not always very successful because some of the laws are basically very difficult to change in India. For example, laws around agricultural market commodities or land laws. And yes, but just to say it in summary, yes, there has been. But I mean, the crisis is so large. I think they need to do much more.
Yeah, we shouldn't sit around here thinking that, you know, India is some kind of irresponsible country that doesn't care. This would be an incredibly simplistic way of looking at it. This is an agrarian country. More than 60% of the population lives in the countryside and is farming. And for many politicians, this is their primary vote bank. India is full of extremely serious bureaucrats and politicians who are traumatized by these questions and all that sort of thing. But what is the purpose of a state today? The state's purpose is to grow GDP. And to grow GDP, it must compete for capital on international markets, and it must do deals with international corporations. That's how you get investment in. So the state is not responsible only for 1.5 billion people. The state is responsible to a whole bunch of competing factions, some of which shout louder and have much more power than others. And for instance, in this sector, one of the factions that's a lot of power is the textile industry, because the textile industry also employs hundreds of thousands of people, has responsibilities to pay wages and all that sort of thing. So the textile industry can say, you know, the price of cotton has gone very high, our business our profits are in danger, how are we going to pay our workers? And the government says, well, we should keep the cost of cotton down, and the farmer loses. But balancing all these interests, being a modern country and you know, having American and German corporations sort of setting up and doing business there requires politicians to make extremely difficult decisions. And I think that, I mean, to some extent we're seeing this in the US today, but a country like India is not just one country. It is a first world country with extremely wealthy, well-educated people living in cities and doing all kinds of, and earning the same salaries as people would in New Haven. And it is a third world country of, you know, 900 million villagers. And these groups have very different interests and very different views of the world. And ultimately, the peasants usually lose because they simply don't have the money and they don't have the political articulation that people in the cities do. And that's one of the reasons we do this work and start it in this way, because we also are guilty of forgetting that these people are part of our global community and all that sort of thing. And making them visible and giving them some sort of position in our conversations about politics and economics is important for all of us, I think.
Very good. Thank you, Rana. I think that actually brings us to the end of our time. So I just want to thank Rana Dasgupta and Maria Maslani for joining us for the Global Countryside, and please do take a listen to their podcast when you have a chance.
Yeah, I should say it's called Harvest, and it's available on Audible.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shivi.